Very quickly, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on STEM education, the state of New Hampshire's efforts in STEM education and coding robotics. My name is Josh Schuler. I work for the Intelitek STEM and CTE Education Foundation, where I'm the director of the Cyber Robotics Coding Competition. I'm joined by David Benedetto, STEM Coordinator for the state of New Hampshire's Department of Education. I'm excited to have David here today to share his thoughts on STEM education, how things are going in New Hampshire, and of course, how we collaborated on the first statewide competition for the Cyber Robotics competition in New Hampshire. I think it's important to note before we start that New Hampshire is significant for many reasons, not the least of which is its position in the U.S. election cycle, but there's tremendous technology here, tremendous opportunities afforded to young people in terms of educational enrichment, and a very supportive partner to us, the Commissioner of Education, Commissioner Edelblue, and we're very happy to have him here, or his support, I should say. We have his colleague David here. A few housekeeping notes. Obviously, we are recording this session and we'll make the recording available to you. We welcome your questions and thank you for already using the chat to let us know that the audio wasn't working. And as you've shown, you know how to submit a question by typing it into either the question box or the chat box in the lower corner of the GoToWebinar. For those of you attending, if this is your first webinar of ours, I'll tell you a little bit about Intelitek. We've been a pioneer in robotics and education for more than 30 years. Our cyber robotics platform, known as CoderZ, is an online learning environment that allows students worldwide to program 3D virtual robots, both in the classroom and outside the classroom in activities like CRCC, the Cyber Robotics Coding Competition, and which is organized by the Intelitek STEM and CTE Education Foundation. CRCC is a multi-stage competition consisting of a skill building or scaffolded bootcamp, a week of competitive coding, and a live in-person final event. CoderZ makes learning STEM with robotics accessible, affordable, and fun. And you can learn about CoderZ by visiting gocoderz.com or by following GoCoderZ on Facebook or Twitter. And speaking of Facebook, we are, of course, live streaming this webinar via CoderZ's Facebook page, so we'll have to do some editing there as well. We're going to finish by about 6 o'clock. And David and I will talk for about 45 minutes about a few topics. We'll talk about the challenges of implementing an inclusive STEM curriculum and activities. We'll talk about best practices from New Hampshire. And we'll talk about the Cyber Robotics Coding Competition experience in New Hampshire. Now, what should the takeaways be for you? Well, I have a certain takeaway. I'd like you to gain a better understanding of STEM education opportunities in coding and where things could go, where New Hampshire has been. David had a great idea, and this is before we had the audio issues, as a great way to engage you and make sure you were participating, and that's what do you want your takeaways to be from this webinar. So if you want to take a moment here, I'm going to mute things, and you can take a sec to let us know what you'd like to learn from the webinar. We'll get those relayed to us, and we'll try to hit on those as we go. So we're going to pause here for 1 minute. I'm going to mute it, and then the screen's going to go blank, and we'll come right back. Thanks so much. All right, folks. I'm not muted anymore. We're back. It's like it is a live TV broadcast. So it's a quick minute. So hopefully some of you are contributing some of the takeaways you'd like to have. We'll leave 15 minutes at the end for open Q&A. We'll field questions from you about STEM, the role robotics plays, and virtual robotics can play in education. And again, feel free to pose these questions at any time during the session, and we'll get to them, I promise. I know I have a few questions for David. Obviously, that's how the interview will run, but we want you guys to participate. So if we want to click ahead, we can go to the agenda. So on the next slide, we can see what the points are. Thank you. We mentioned these challenges of implementing best practices, the Cyber Robotics Competition, and then Q&A. But before getting the challenges, I think it would be really nice to sort of set the stage of inclusive STEM curriculum to talk about STEM and the background of STEM education in the U.S. and New Hampshire specifically, noting that there are a lot of enrichment education opportunities, again, in the state of New Hampshire. So David shared with me a great list, a history which you can see on your screen now. Next one. Thank you.
Certainly not even close to a complete history.
Not a complete history, but
a few highlights.
It's really important to note some of these. So David, you want to talk through some of these? I'm sure our audience knows about them, but I think it's worth noting.
Sure. So if we had a little bit more time for interaction, I think it's always good to kind of do a group brainstorming about what different conceptualizations of STEM are, because different audiences, you get a lot of different ideas of what is STEM. And I think one thing you don't want to do is limit what STEM is. It's certainly not this separate, discrete period of time during the school day. It is engineering, but it's not just engineering. It's more than just engineering. In New Hampshire, we look at STEM as an umbrella. It's science and math, maybe as you know them, maybe not. Engineering, computer science, arts. It's the intersection of these things. There's kind of a how of STEM and a what of STEM. So the how is sort of the philosophy. You talk about inquiry-based science. You talk about constructionism, educational philosophy associated with Seymour Papert. And then there's the how, which you talk about the content, which is connects to basically everything. Is connected to STEM in some way. So I think this brief history here illustrates a few highlights. Some of those things that you can see in there are related to reports and policies, which is kind of the world that I live in. So we have to give credit to Massachusetts for being the first state to adopt engineering program standards. New Hampshire was just behind in the next year in 2002. A lot of states have adopted engineering over the past 10 years or more. And recently we're seeing huge take up in computer science. So again, we're a little bit behind Massachusetts and some other states on that, but we're I'd say in the second wave of states that are getting ready to adopt computer science standards and make a big push in that direction. So we have the engineering and the computer science and some of the more traditional natural sciences and mathematics and integration and different ways to engage students. So some of those reports that you'll see on the screen, I'd encourage you to Google them and read them. They talk about the importance of engineering education and computer science education to meet the needs of our country and to provide opportunities for our kids.
Well, thanks, David. I think one of the interesting things to note here is some of these are funded by companies, these research reports and policy, and some by the federal government, NSF, et cetera.
Yeah.
And you sort of downplay a little bit that these are in the policy world, but these have huge implications in terms of programs that start or programs that get funded because of these policies and because of these reports. So it's a big deal to understand the history. And I know Rising Above the Gathering Storm, that had a huge push on enrichment activities, in New England at least, and then across the country. So.
Yeah, so Rising Above the Gathering Storm, that's a report by the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Talking about how we're in a knowledge-based economy now, and we need to change our education system accordingly. The Running on Empty is a similar report regarding computer science.
Yeah. I think that's definitely one we should take a look at more deeply. Maybe we can do a follow-up webinar discussing Running on Empty. But another important thing to note here, this is just in the U.S., and a lot of other countries are working in this space as well, and some are way ahead of the U.S. and some are in the same position. So it'd be interesting to do maybe a conversation on that as well. You always hear about test results.
Right, we hear about the
Danish
international tests, and we hear about those comparisons.
Yep.
And it's kind of interesting how U.S. is a huge country, and we're compared as this big block. And there's all sorts of differences. And if you look at different measures, maybe like number of patents filed, things look a little bit more positive. Right. So there's all sorts of different ways to look at it.
Yeah. A lot of ways to slice it.
Yeah.
And just one more note before we move on to the challenges of inclusive STEM curriculum. I like the way you were talking about it's this STEM bridges all these things in engineering. It's not just one specific discipline. It crosses and touches things, and that's great. And one of the things I like most about STEM is how when you're trying to define STEM or STEAM or whatever you want to call it, how almost visceral or real world it is, and how the applications are there, and how young people can learn so much more effectively if it's either they can see something move or it's tangible. I was trying to,
and they're taking the reins of their own education.
Yeah, that's really terrific to see that. So thanks. And again, this is just a brief history, a snippet of some big events or reports that happen in STEM education in the U.S. So let's move on to challenges of inclusive STEM curriculum and enrichment activities. You and I talked about this a little bit. What are the main challenges of implementing a STEM program that is really inclusive, meaning as many students as possible can get into it? And not only that, it's relevant. There are all these activities that may be inclusive of some but not others, and may be relevant for some but not others. What are we facing here? What are these challenges?
Yeah, so I put together a little list of some challenges, each of which could very easily be the topic of an entire, very active research areas, or the topic of multiple webinars. So some of them I put together. One would be what I would call baggage, or systemic challenges. So maybe traditional notions of education or math and science education, kind of old habits that die hard. And a lot of systemic challenges we have a really big education system with lots of interlocking pieces. You talk about educator preparation, you talk about federal and state programs, you talk about, you talk about social challenges. There's just a lot that the education system is a big complex system, and there are lots of challenges to change something like that. Also, with the student, we educators know that a student that doesn't have the social and emotional support, or doesn't have a stable home, or doesn't have food, is not going to learn STEM or anything else. And that's tied in with some of the previous challenges. So getting a little bit more specific on STEM, bias plays a big role in this, and not just explicit bias, but implicit bias. If you haven't heard that term or looked into that, I would strongly encourage you. There's a lot of literature on implicit bias. Basically thinking who can learn STEM, who ought to learn STEM. Ideas that engineering and computer science are these things that are for only the best and the brightest, whatever that means, and not accessible to all students. And so some of those notions create barriers.
That's interesting. The biases. Sorry to interrupt, but the biases there are like a scientist is only someone who wears a white lab coat and is a man. And so therefore only people who wear white lab coats and are male can be scientists, and those are pervasive, and hopefully we're chipping away at those. But images play a big role, and I think we're seeing a lot of good movement with trying to address that. I mean, it's interesting with computer science, especially. In the 80s, there were a much higher percentage of females that were earning computer science degrees, and when people hear that, they're often surprised. What is that? And I would encourage you to look into trends in female participation in computer science, and it's just coming back up again now. So there's some gains being made, but there's still a lot of work to do. Yeah, I mean, we certainly hear it at Intelitek and the Intelitek STEM Education Foundation and CoderZ and CRCC believe anyone can learn to code and should learn to code. So
absolutely.
We're trying to do our part in countering that bias.
Yeah, there's also the idea that engineering is and computer science, there's a whole learning progression associated with that.
Right.
And that's kind of, if students don't have any exposure to that except for at home, then it's not going to be equitable.
Are you talking about academic preparation versus experience?
So if we look at, for example, here's one thing that is maybe a theory for female enrollment. So you look at like toy marketing, maybe a decade ago. I think it's gotten better, but it's still, you go to the different toy aisles in a toy store and you see the difference still. I guess it's better, but when computers and electronics, it's been marketed as a toy for boys, and it's geeky boys at that. So
Well, I guess we should thank certain toy manufacturers who are trying to counter that. I know Lego's doing their part in that for sure. And that's neat to see some of the new figures coming out that representing famous STEM contributors and scientists.
New gadgets, new things, and new paradigms, new ideas, and new contexts for teaching
progress.
STEM.
So another challenge that I know we talked about was sort of vision and leadership. If you don't have somebody sort of leading from the top and encouraging these changes, and that it's okay to bring STEM curriculum and try things, that can be a hurdle.
Yeah, so a couple other challenges here. I don't know if we were going to talk about it in another section about best practices. Maybe it would be a good time to talk about it.
We can transition to best practices.
Yeah, sure. I could just go right into it when talking about best practices.
As you like.
So some things talking about vision and leadership, and that could be at a number of levels. It could be at federal level, it could be at state level, it could be at district level, it could be at school, and also capacity. So a number of different ways of thinking about capacity. So that's what kind of time you have in the day, what kind of financial resources you have, what kind of personnel you have. So a couple ideas or recommendations on that. So one is we know that leadership has to be shared, it has to be distributed.
Sure.
You need, if you want to make this happen at a school or in a district, you need teachers, administrators, you need students, parents. you need everybody kind of owning this together. And there are ways to get those people together and create change. When we talk about some of the other challenges as far as time, financial resources, personnel, a lot of that, you can look at program design and what sort of resources are available out there.
Sure.
And there are a lot of resources that can help. And that's one of the things. There are, I guess, one of the main things is broadband. There are schools that still don't have broadband and don't have working computers, and that's a serious challenge. But with a platform like CoderZ, for example, if you have broadband and you have working computer, it makes a lot of these sort of virtual things accessible, whereas more conventional robotics or bigger equipment could be not accessible for a lot of schools. And the same with a lot of these virtual resources. There's great learning materials available online and resources available for educators who might not think of themselves as engineering or computer science experts and don't have a lot of experience with that, but want to jump in, want to learn and innovate and help their students.
You're hitting on something that often doesn't get discussed, and that's the teacher educator. Sometimes in the equation we're very focused or sometimes hyper focused on the students and the kids, and that's very important. But we also need to spend a lot of time and resources on helping educators, some of whom, like you said, don't think of themselves as engineers or scientists or coding or coders, but could use some support, and with a little bit of encouragement, they can. And that's a valuable thing to do, and professional development can certainly help with that.
Yeah, that's a huge part of what we do at the Department of Education is supporting educators. So there was a question here about what does the Department of Education do, and how do we try and advance STEM education. So there's the policy stuff, and we get educators involved in policy, and try and make those connections between legislators and people at the state level and education district level and schools, so that everyone's working together to make the right kind of policies. And then as far as implementing those, there's federal and state grant programs, and a lot of those are directed towards alleviating some of those challenges that we talked about earlier, as far as capacity, and provide resources to support teachers and help them get what they need to get as far as professional development or other resources. And then partnerships is huge. So at the state level, we don't provide direct services to the schools necessarily. We sometimes do, but really we try and find good partnerships, and that could be through a number of different means. It could be through professional associations, through colleges, universities, through business and industry, and nonprofits, and more. So we want to work with people that want to work with schools and that have the right goals in mind of supporting the students and giving them opportunities.
I like to think of, that's great. I like to think of large organizations and states, as far as DOEs as conveners, bringing together the actors or players so that they can have greater impact together in working and improving education and all. So it's a really important role that states can play in identifying good partners for folks, or bringing those partners together so they can collaborate. Because just because you're working in the STEM education field, you may not know all the other players or funders. So convenings are really helpful.
Yeah, one of the things that we were talking about before the webinar started, interestingly, is how you need the right policies, and you need the right, like we talked about, you need the right vision and leadership and implementation and activities, and there's a lot of different pieces at a lot of different levels, and you kind of need those pieces to come together, and that can come, an initiative to move in a certain direction or move forward in a certain area can come from a number of different ways. It can come from legislation, it can come from the state departments, it can come from grassroots efforts and advocacy. So there's a role for everyone, and everyone needs to work together to make the right kind of things happen.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about accessibility, because you mentioned that as one of the big challenges, both for educators and schools and students and broadband, and how making something more accessible can open up opportunities to more youth and more teachers. And again, that's something really important to us here at Intelitek and CoderZ and CRCC, and cost as well. I mean, these are the things, like you said, these are the basic challenges. But related to that, why do you think it's important to bring STEM to more students? I guess it's sort of, it's an obvious question. It's like, well, why isn't it important? But in your mind, so I have two questions. Why is it important to bring STEM to more students, and how do you sort of focus on the change that you want? You mentioned this, sort of panoply of challenges, some of which are very long-term and entrenched, some of which are less so. So why is it important to bring STEM, and how do you focus on change, and sort of what level of change do you specifically push for DOE, I guess?
Yeah, okay, that's a big question.
Yeah,
let me try and unpack that. So why is it important to bring STEM to more students? There's a number of reasons. The equity issue is, some people look at this, it's a social justice issue.
Absolutely.
There's the economy, there's security, when you talk about cybersecurity, and you talk about ethics and technology and society, and who's developing these tools, and does everyone have to say and how these tools. So there's something. So
if Facebook is listening.
Yeah, right, of course. But I'll talk about a couple of things. So,
yeah, sorry.
So one is why is it important to bring STEM to more students? One is because we know that we have issues especially in math education.
Sure.
It's over and over again, we can't move the needle on math education. And I like to say, like, we're trying to solve the problem by saying, well, let's just do more of what we're doing.
Yeah. It's
not working. Let's do more of it. And it's crazy. And we know that if students are going to learn, they need to be engaged.
Right.
And that's what STEM can do. STEM can engage students, and then the learning of the core math concepts can follow from that. So, and then another thing is I always go into economy. So there's a Bureau of Labor Statistics report that came out within the past year. It's called STEM Occupations, Past, Present, Future.
That's right, yeah.
And it shows, currently, I think, I don't remember the exact stats, but computer science, computing occupations, and engineering occupations are the majority of STEM occupations as identified. There's also a lot of occupations in healthcare. And those
growing opportunities.
Right, and they're growing fast. So if we think about like scientists as people wearing white lab coats, that's a tiny sliver of employment in the United States. Though the jobs are in engineering. A lot of the jobs are in engineering and computing. And that's why we need to think of STEM more broadly.
So it's interesting. Often when I'm thinking about STEM education, and you think about role models, and you think about the society and societal role models, and you think about the probability of becoming a professional athlete, and how that young people sometimes, and some young people are fixed on that and aren't aware of the probabilities. It's sort of, there's a mismatch as well in terms of views as what is someone in a STEM career, and where are the actual opportunities. For a professional athlete or a super rock star, there are many inventors, engineers, scientists who did things to help get that person there, or that are part of that person's world that nobody knows about. So in effect, you can be part of that professional athlete's world if you get into STEM. So anyway, as a side,
another interesting thing that you just made me think about too is, like, we think when we think of scientists and engineers, we think of these people with advanced degrees,
right.
Masters or doctorates.
Yep.
But there are tons and tons and tons of STEM jobs that are what we call, they're like middle, like you don't require a bachelor's. They maybe require a certification or an associate's. Yep. There are tons of opportunities in the middle, and sometimes we don't think about that middle. Yeah. It's not blue collar or white collar. The majority of jobs are I don't know, it's something
mixture. I mean, there's that whole
the lines
bell curve. The lines are building, and the bell curve and the opportunities, and that's where I often think about this in terms of the bachelor's degree and master's and PhD. That's such a small slice of that upper part of that bell curve of the population that goes after that. It's missing this whole larger part. The career technical education world is huge, and there's so much opportunity there, and there's going to be so much more opportunity there. What can we do to help augment that or work on that? Really quickly, I think you were touching on, in a way, different ways of learning math. You pound it into them, and some of them will get it that way. But in a lot of cases, you learn it in applied ways. One of the best math classes I attended, not my own, but I was visiting a few schools, was a way he helped kids learn, basic math and budgeting. And this teacher had them, come up with their ideal life and their apartment and their car and this and that, and figure out how much all that would cost. And then they had to figure out what job, what they needed to earn in their job to pay for that and have a little bit for savings. And then he flipped that and said, okay, now let's look at salaries and wages and what things you need to make that sort of life happen. And it was pretty visceral, and it was a pretty powerful lesson. Yeah. And they were learning math.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to make sure that I say that I certainly don't want to knock, science or math teachers, because there are so many science and math teachers that are innovating and that are bringing in, new things, and there's a lot of innovations happening.
You were not doing that at all.
I mean, I former math teacher, computer science teacher.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good. All right, let's keep things moving. I know there are a few questions coming in, but let me keep moving and get a little more specific on coding and sort of technology in general. We talked about STEM. Let's get a little more specific here. Do you consider, and this is a discussion Ito and I have had, and I think we started talking about it, would you consider coding or even technology in a broader sense sort of like another language that could be learned in a school that has broad implications, or a skill set? Is it, how do we position learning a new language or learning a new skill set so that so schools can be enthusiastic about it, so there's less trepidation or apprehension? Again, this is related to all those challenges, I know, but let's just take coding. If coding is a new language, and in many ways it is, to add to the languages that are taught, in secondary ed and primary ed for that matter too, how do we approach that?
Yeah, I guess there are sort of different ways to. I had an interesting conversation with someone in the DevTech research group down at Tufts, and they work on Scratch Junior and like the Kipo blocks, and they work on like early elementary computer science education. And they were talking about basing it in language and basing it in language learning rather than basing it in math paradigms. And I thought that was really interesting to think about that. And a number of states are looking at it in different ways. They're saying, is computer science math? Is it science? Is it a language? And I think yes is the answer to all of those, right? And also,
I'm gonna keep pressing. Come on.
with coding, it's. I've pushed a lot, or I've done a lot of work to kind of try and shift the conversation. And I know a lot of people in a lot of areas are trying to shift the conversation. Like, coding is very important, and coding is the language of computer science. Sure. Like we want to think about computer science more broadly. So the coding and the algorithms is very important, but also computing systems and data analysis and all these different aspects.
Not just one thing.
Right, but coding is coding and math. I look at science and engineering. Like, science is asking and answering questions, and engineering is making stuff. And math and computer science and coding those are the tools that allow those things to happen.
I like that. Let's say. Can you say that again?
So okay, sure. So science is asking and answering questions. Engineering is making stuff. And math and computer science are tools that allow that to happen and advance that. And increasingly, computer science, like computational science, is driving developments, huge developments in science and engineering. Absolutely. And we can't overlook that. Right. It's not just this one path. Like, coding isn't just this one thing that software engineers do. Right. It's critical to any scientific, mathematical engineering endeavor and other endeavors. You look at like web design or graphic design, artistic endeavors, in a number of different areas.
It's sounding more and more like a language.
Yeah.
It just pervades everything in that case. That's great. So
but math is a language too.
That's true. Math and music is a language. I was going to say. Right. There you go. Those are three amazing things. It'd be interesting to see. This is another PhD. The overlap in people who are excelling or have talents and skills in those different areas and how they reach across and all of
Yeah, it's interesting if you think about other countries, like you were talking about other countries, like
Sure.
you hear everybody likes to talk about the Scandinavian countries and how great they are. I've heard that there's big emphasis in like younger grades on music education.
Sure.
And it's interesting. I haven't seen any longitudinal studies on the impacts of music education for all students, but I think that's a really interesting connection that deserves to be explored. I'm sure it has been explored. I'd like to read about it.
All right, we're going to keep moving now. I let you off the hook with that really deep, tangled question, so maybe we'll shelve that one for now. But that was, how do you focus as where you sit? How do you focus on change?
Right.
But we're gonna skip ahead because I know it's a tough one. I know we have a number of questions coming in, and we're getting.
I think we focus on capacity. I think that's where I think that's where we can help push the needle.
Okay. All right. I'll take it. We're getting close to the 6 o'clock, or at least the shift to Q&A, so I want to just keep moving a little bit. We talked, through a number of best practices already, which was the next topic we were going to cover. What leadership and vision and partners and convenings and standards and how we can set standards for schools, districts, and educators. So I think we've pretty much covered best practices. If you're okay with that, was there any? The federal and state programs that the Department of Education manages and works with. I think we're pretty well. Now I want to. We're getting close, but how can schools implement relevant STEM? There was one here about student inquiry, voice, and choice. I really like that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What you meant there?
Yes. Absolutely. So, I mean, there's kind of a whole spectrum, I guess. Or maybe it's more complicated than a linear spectrum. But on the one end, you stick a kid in a makerspace or whatever in a place with a bunch of neat stuff, and you say go for it, right? On the other end is this very sort of top down like lecture, maybe, or I don't know what grade levels you're talking about, but very like maybe like here's a worksheet or these are the specific things that you're going to learn.
Yeah.
And I think it's so
choice.
Right. So
voice and
so I think you need this. Like this is personally, my kind of idea on this. I think that you need some of the skills development and you need some open-ended stuff. Like you need those two things both. And where student voice and choice can come in is if you start with what the students know and you relate them, you allow them to bring their interests to bear and their context to bear and have choice in the design of their projects and even maybe if you have like a sort of a nonlinear or differentiated classroom where students can select different pathways and different projects. The more that you can allow students to have the ownership of what they're doing and it becomes theirs, and the more engaged they're going to be, and the more proud they're going to be, and the more they're going to want. They're going to feel like they're a party to the process, and not just this like passive, receptive kind of.
So self-directed learning, more so, and going after your passions and interests. It's one of the things that I like about a lot of enrichment programs is they'll go about providing here's a framework, here's some things to learn. Now go and find a problem or something of interest to you that you can use this tool or this skill or this language. How can you use coding now? You've got the basics of Blockly and Java. Now how can you go solve some problems that you're passionate about? And you need some help sometimes. Identifying a problem or a challenge can be
I like just-in-time learning too. So you kind of like throw this challenge at the students and they look at it, they mess around with it, they kind of look at it from different angles and they struggle now. They say, I don't know. And then I think there's like just the right amount of struggle, or maybe just the right, like frustration means that learning is happening. Like just the right amount of frustration. And then the teacher can come in and say, oh, maybe let's talk about this, and then you can kind of like
shift a little
give them the resource that they need right at that time to solve that problem. And they're like, oh yes, that's what I need.
That's awesome. That's a sign. That's a good educator. That's memorable. So we're running very short on time. I want to shift very quickly to CRCC, the Cyber Robotics Coding Competition in New Hampshire's experience, and then we'll do questions. I know I'm excited to share the next few slides, if we could advance to those. And we'll go, and hopefully you all can see these. Here's basically the summary of CRCC. We like to talk about the other 99%, how we can reach those who aren't normally given the opportunity to do coding. In most cases, coding is for this, it's that perception of a software programmer only, whereas learning to code should be an opportunity for a lot more, so they can envision themselves using coding as a language. We use Blockly, which is a very much a very easy to learn and play with, honestly, programming language. CRCC is mission-based, so it's gamified and specific, self-directed. We just spoke about how important self-directed learning is. No hardware and cloud-based. That speaks to the accessibility of the opportunity. Low floor, high ceiling. That just speaks to the fact that it can engage students and educators with low or little computer science background or programming experience to those with a lot. And you can take that journey, and through CRCC, you can prepare yourself for doing Java programming and beyond. So very quick about CRCC, but more importantly, let's go to New Hampshire, and you can see how our collaboration panned out. So we have the next sort of set of slides, I think, about New Hampshire. And this was a partnership, of course, with the Department of Ed, Oracle Academy, and the NBT Bank was a good supporter as well. Let's keep moving here. And we had over 2,500 students participating across the state of New Hampshire, and this is about an 8-week opportunity. Those 2,500 some odd students came from schools all across the state. I think one of the things I was impressed with is it wasn't just the students close to us in some of the more urban areas, but it was also kids from several hours away in rural settings and homeschools. That's one of the strengths of an accessible program is all these students can do.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how I think at some point we're going to talk about how it came together too.
We can, if there's time.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. I mean, we had a pretty short timeline on this, and the fact that the engagement that we were able to get on that short timeline, I think, is a testament to how much interest is there. And New Hampshire is a small state, so that might look like nothing in a much larger state. But New Hampshire is a small state.
So why don't we hit on that now? How did this collaboration come to be?
Sure. So I don't know if there's other things that aren't part of this story. Oh, excuse me.
Pay no attention to the man behind us.
So this is my recollection.
Yeah.
I might be missing some things, but the commissioner and I were invited down to have a tour of Intelitek.
Sure.
With the commissioner of the Business and Economic Affairs was here too, and we just kind of walked around and checked out different things. And one of the things we looked at was the CoderZ platform. I had actually seen it because I was a teacher in this area, a computer science teacher in this area, and I had come in, and some of my students had actually been beta testers with the platform prior to that. So I had met some Intelitek folks prior to that. But we came through, and the commissioner was like, "This is great." And so fast forward a little while later, we're talking about what we're going to do for Computer Science Education Week.
And you remembered.
Yeah, actually, the commissioner remembered. Right. So the commissioner remembered. He said, "Let's work with them and let's get this going. Let's do this program for students." And so we got on the phone with the Intelitek folks and went from there. And it's working with Intelitek was great. They really took it and ran with it, and it was pretty low overhead for us. At the department, like I said, we work with partnerships, and we don't have a huge amount of capacity, and so the fact that Intelitek ran with this was a huge benefit for us, and it helped us get word out about our initiatives, and it helped get students engaged. So it was a win-win.
That's important for us when we partner with states, and we've gone on. This is to partner with additional states, new states, and leveraging the state networks and their endorsement of the opportunity has been terrific, and being able to rely on you to communicate that out, the opportunities, it's really valuable. So, as we think about other states to expand to, we're looking for partners, obviously, and at the state level, departments of ed are terrific. Intermediate units, other units, major districts, that's huge. I'll point out right now, because again, we're running short on time, where we've gone a little bit since New Hampshire and where we're going, and then we can get back to some of these results. Since New Hampshire, we had a major competition in Israel that engaged over 19,000 students. That was huge for us. We had a smaller competition in Paraguay that was amazing. We did a one-day competition out in Clark County, Nevada. That's one of Las Vegas's major school district out there. And next week, we're really excited because we're having another finals event, similar to the one we had right up the street here for New Hampshire, at the USA Science and Engineering Festival. The festival happens every 2 years in DC, where we're bringing students, middle school students from DC, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania together for their final in-person phase of the competition. So we're excited about that.
And just like in the election cycle, we like to say we're the first in the nation.
Yeah, there you go. See, I knew that was going to tie together. You didn't think that was going to. But yes, New Hampshire is the first in the nation, so we're very excited about that. A few more stats really quickly, and then I think we need to shift to questions in order to fulfill our obligation there. But we can just buzz through a few of these. This shows sort of the grade participation in New Hampshire. As we noted, it's heavily skewed towards middle school, which is terrific. And that's really the focus in DC. This new competition is purely focused on middle school students, engaging 100 teachers in New Hampshire, and I'm sure that number was actually higher because of all the teachers involved. This next one shows sort of the distribution of schools, and you can see they're pretty well spread out, including probably that school I mentioned that was several hours away up in the northern part of New Hampshire. Keep moving here. Again, these are the folks involved: Oracle Academy, NBT Bank, and of course the Department of Ed. This was, I think, significant and something if we had more time we would talk about. We touched on this a little bit in terms of in the 80s, women were getting more degrees in CS, but we had about half participants in New Hampshire were female. That was great. We invited these 62 finalist schools to the competition, the finals, and we're very excited with the results there. And we're excited to continue to work with you in the years ahead. And we have these phases, which I mentioned earlier about the competition, the boot camp, and all that. And here's, this basically sums up where we've been and where we're going. We're picking up a few more states. We're very excited about that. We're in MOUs with a lot of these that are in final stages, and we're very excited to move forward. And if anyone's listening, and I know we didn't tell you a lot about what the competition actually is, but I think you could tell by the conversation that it was pretty impactful for the Department of Education in New Hampshire and New Hampshire students. So we're excited about that. So if you are interested, reach out to us, and we'd be happy to talk with you. We're going to shift now to Q&A. So please keep them coming in. I know we have a few questions that came in. If I could grab those. Thanks so much. All right. So one question, how did you use virtual competition to engage kids? So that's something I can answer, and maybe David can speak to it as well. But we used the virtual competition to engage kids because it was gamified. There were incentives, there were motivations to finish, to complete missions. You would get a certificate. The leaderboard, that's good. There's an internal leaderboard for students could see it. There was an external leaderboard so you could see your school and how your school was doing versus other schools. And there was finals at the end that you had to compete to get a seat at the table for the finals. So that's how we used it to engage kids. That was exciting. What's that?
Oh, nothing. On the next question. Award categories, right?
Oh yeah. So one of the ways we engaged more kids was through specific awards, and one of the awards we gave out and continue to give out is what we call the Inclusiveness Award, which encourages as much of a school as possible to get engaged and active in the competition. So we actually have an Inclusiveness prize. How do we help increase inclusiveness or help teachers recruit more students? Well, we have videos that talk about the competition in both English and Spanish. We do through the webinar, we give them not tricks, but tips on how to engage more students. We'll give them posters. We encourage them, and that's how we do it. Just a lot of, honestly, we say keep going, and we give them some tools to help with upping the inclusiveness score. We use that inclusiveness score as an invitation carrot as well. Schools in earlier parts of the competition that include more of their school population in the competition are more likely to get an invitation to the in-person final.
One of the things that we noted too in a prior conversation was that some schools elected to opt their whole class in,
right,
and other schools gave it as an option, maybe for students that were done their work early or something like that.
There you go. Yep.
So it was interesting that I think I'm not sure the data was there, but the educators that encourage their whole class to participate
it's great when we see that because that means the educator really wants to push it and has the flexibility to be able to push it in the classroom. Not all educators are able to do that. We're thankful for however way they can get their students doing it. But yeah, you're right. Some of them bring it in class and they do it as part of the curriculum. Some of them do it extracurricularly after school, and that's great. Some of them, it sort of blends into both, especially during Week of Code, I think, which is the more intensive period.
Yeah, and students might have preconceived notions about whether or not they are going to like it or whether or not
exactly.
they can do it. So just getting them like on there to try it out.
That's a win. Yeah, if we look at the numbers, we see some kids who've tried a few things. They're like, okay, now I know what this is about, and maybe they keep going, and maybe they say, you know what, not for me right now. They might come back to it, but at least they're aware of it, and that's a powerful thing. And one of the things that we like to do is see, and we talk with the teachers about this, look for the students who are doing really well, who are finishing, completing a bunch of missions really quickly. Okay, so maybe they have more experience with coding or more comfort there. Have them work with the students who are, not as quick with the programming or coding, and who may decide, I don't want this anymore. You can get some really good peer-to-peer mentoring or encouragement going. All right, other questions from folks? Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Sandra. Okay, here we go. So this is a great question. Will STEM activities or enrichment activities become mainstream or remain an elective or after-school activity? I guess, are these STEM activities that are sort of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary?
In New Hampshire, sure. I can say it's different school to school. It's becoming more and more mainstream. More and more schools are incorporating this into the earliest grades. Like a lot of states, I think like a lot of states, we have technology and engineering program requirements for all schools in middle school, in secondary, middle school, and high school grade levels. And a lot of that goes with the policy stuff. So there's some policy under development right now regarding computer science. So if the policies are right, then it will become mainstream, and and that's why the policy stuff is important to ensure that it sticks around and that it becomes a part of the system. Love or hate the system.
You have to be a player in it to make it
right, exactly. If it's allowed to be an elective, it will be an elective because schools have resource conscious. Now in New Hampshire, there's always the concern. We don't want to, more and more like unfunded mandates. You can have more unfunded mandates. So if we're going to say, like, 15 years ago or whatever, when we started requiring technology and engineering, we had to have a program. We had to put in at the same time a program with some funding to provide sort of seed money for schools to get those programs up and running. Similar with computer science, you have to, if the state is gonna, you have to provide some resources. So one thing that we're really lucky to have in New Hampshire is VLAX, which is a virtual online charter school or charter high school. So if a school doesn't have the capacity to offer computer science, then their students can take that online. And we know that there's no substitute for a good solid class with a real teacher face to face, but it's there and it's an option for students so that they can transition and work to.
That's good. They can bridge that.
So they can get their other capacity in line.
Very good. Yeah. So we have two really good questions. We have had a bunch of really good ones. These are some neat ones. What international best practices are we looking at? We mentioned Scandinavia. Let's say in the coding space, specifically, what international best practices are you aware of? Who do we look to?
Well, I'm involved with the Computer Science Teachers Association. There are it's an international organization, and there are representatives on the board from the UK and from I believe Honduras. And it's interesting how I think the best practices are developing nationally. Like the CS for All movement, I mean, that's what it's called in the US, the CS for All movement. It might have different names in different places, but it's a global movement, and the principles are unified. I think that's we're all on the same page as far as I see.
So coming up with something that everybody can.
And as we talked about previously, certainly there are different countries that have different educational philosophies.
No, absolutely.
I do the best I can to keep track of what's going on especially New Hampshire and the U.S.
Fair enough. We'll do that as something like that. This is another neat question. What's the optimal age to introduce STEM to ensure more STEM graduates? So at what age do you start the pipeline?
The beginning,
yeah.
I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and everything is STEM. The kids are curious, and if you're rolling a ball down a hill, that's physics. It's intuitive physics. So there's as soon as possible.
Yeah, so I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I was trying to teach her about forces when she was jumping on snowbanks and was scattering snow everywhere on things that we didn't want snow scattered on. And I tried to teach her about forces there, and then take her backpack and say, you don't want your backpack squished. It's got to.
Yeah.
But there are neat real world ways you can show these things and demonstrate.
Yeah, I gotta shout out my 4-year-old Jude. I mean, he's really into Legos. My daughter is really into Legos too. She's just a little bit younger, but she's right behind him. She picks up everything that he does, and he's getting into some coding with Blockly now too. So.
Very cool. Glad to hear it.
And one thing that I do want to say is that there are some concerns. I've heard a lot of concerns about screen time. How much screen time are kids getting? And absolutely, you have to. We don't want to be having our kids on screens too much. Like, I totally get that. There are a lot of, within computer science, there are a lot of unplugged activities you can do to learn about computing concepts and computational thinking that don't even require a computer. Okay. So that's one kind of thing. And then the other thing too is I hear some concerns about, like, what about like interaction? What about like person-to-person skills?
Yep.
Person-to-person skills.
Soft skills.
Right. And so that's why collaboration and facilitating collaborative work in the classroom is so important too, and not just virtual collaboration, but like real collaboration of people working face to face.
One of the neat things, or things that we do at the finals, which is different from CRCC, which is different from the rest, is we have the students work in teams of 2. So you'll have them, trying to figure out the coding, entering the coding, writing the coding, doing the logic, and working together on it. It's a neat thing to see. So I definitely appreciate the teamwork aspect and the interactive aspect to that.
Yeah.
Any more questions from the audience? No more questions. There were a number of questions I had that we didn't have time for. So David, I'm going to use this time to say, hey, can we do this again?
Sure,
okay. On the spot. So David, thank you. I enjoyed this. I learned a lot. I think we're going to wrap up and say goodbye to everyone. To continue this conversation, I recommend following the CoderZ Facebook page and you can find it by doing @CoderZ. Join the Robotics and STEM for All Facebook group at facebook.com/group/STEM for All. As I mentioned before, a recording of this webinar, edited because we have that lovely block at the beginning where you couldn't hear me or us, will be sent out to all registrants. Thank you all for listening and participating. Look forward to having you again participate in one of our Intelitek STEM and Education Foundation, Intelitek, CoderZ webinars. And David, again, thank you.
Thank you,
really
Josh.
Nice having you.
And thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you.